You're 25, you're 26. Life is good for you as a white person.
Something happened that changed the way I conducted myself from the time I was 20. I was asked to be a guinea pig in a third-year psych student's experiment.
How was the feel like during that period of transition for you? Could you feel the tension?
It's hard to talk about.
Why did you visit Steve Biko's grave?
So, Yvonne, we obviously here to speak about the time of my life, your memoir. My first question for you is, what is your mission for the person reading this book? So what are you hoping that they get out of this book once they've read it?
A sense of what a curious child saw growing up in apartheid South Africa, and what a still curious woman felt growing old in democratic South Africa.
Wow.
And everything in between. I had a fortunate life. I think the fact that my dad was Jewish, the fact that I grew up in a Jewish community where most of the dads were ex-servicemen from the Second World War. Some had lost eyes and had a glass eye. Some had shrapnel in their faces. Some had lost limbs. Pilots who fought in the Battle of Britain needed a glass to ground them. Afterwards, they drank a lot. Growing up in that environment, I was very aware that we had come through a war based on race, conquest for land, and it was never far from my thoughts. My dad had a cousin. She escaped from Berlin in 1936, which was the year that Hitler became the Führer. It was the year that Jan Smuts and Herzog promulgated the Alien Control Act that prohibited Jewish refugees, from coming into South Africa because they were felt to be unassimilable. But my Auntie Millie came, and I used to look at her and look at my dad and think, but they're ordinary people. Why is there something about them? And Auntie Millie left South Africa in the early 50s because when she was in Berlin, Jews were not allowed to go to the opera. And in the early 50s in South Africa, black people weren't allowed to sit on certain benches. And as a little girl, I'm sort of thinking, is history repeating itself? And funnily enough, when I went to England when I was 27, 28, I saw her again before she died, which was a complete circle. But my dad experienced anti-Semitism after the war, and he was one of the first South Africans to enlist, and they got a red tab. And his uniform used to be in the disused shower at home. And I used to look at this, and it had leather shiny buckles and belts. And I'd look at it. And my dad joined an anti-Nazi protest group in Port Elizabeth. And this was known as the Grey Shirts, which was modeled on Hitler's bully boy brown shirts. They were paramilitary group of terrorizing Jewish people. And he heckled, and he got knocked out by a guy called Roby Leibrand. And he fell unconscious into the ornamental fountain at what was known as the Feather Market Hall in PE. And if his mates hadn't plucked him out, he would have drowned. That Roby Leibrand was a South African middleweight boxing champion. He went to Berlin. It's not funny.
No, I mean, he just, the way you've introduced him, I'm thinking, geez, he got knocked out. Then you say, no, actually, he was a middleweight. He was a boxer.
Roby Leibrand
Sure.
was the boxer.
Yeah.
And he went to the 36 Olympic Games and missed out on a podium finish. But while he was there, Roby Leibrand became imbued with Nazi zeal, went back and became what they call an Abwehr, a secret service member of the Nazi party, and came back to South Africa in a U-boat during the war with the intention of overthrowing the Smuts government.
What's a U-boat?
A U-boat was the name for a German submarine.
The vessel.
And they really ruled the seas during the First World War. And the submarines, of course, terrorized the convoys that traveled from America, New York to Britain with food and armaments for the marooned British island of England during the war. And they would ply the Atlantic Ocean in the middle of winter. But these U-boats or German submarines were always tracking them. And then the code got broken by a lot of women working for the British Secret Service unit. And we could then track the U-boats, and the convoys could then get through much freer. But Roby Leibrand was dropped off on the South African coast, and the captain made a mistake, and he got dropped off on the coast, I think somewhere near PE. The farmer found him, handed him over to the police, and he was sentenced to death. And he went to Koffiefontein, which is in sort of Northern Cape, and who was also interned at Koffiefontein was J.B. Vorster, who became our Prime Minister. So anyway, my dad survived being knocked out by Roby Leibrand.
So it's very fascinating because I did a lot of history at school and post-school, and I was privileged enough to come across Adolf Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf.
Yeah.
And I read a lot into it, and then I read the Diary of Anne Frank as well. And I just want to go back to your Aunt Millie, who obviously lived in Berlin at the time of all of this Nazi oppression and the change of Germany. Did she tell you anything about the life of a Jewish person in Berlin at the time? With Anne Frank, I know they were obviously hidden in a closet and they were found. But did she tell you any stories about that time of her being in Berlin as a Jewish person?
No, so I was very small. The photograph I've got of her is me on her lap as an 18-month-old. She didn't, but she did tell me, or the family legend was that when she saw separate entrances for black people and for white people, the echoes of Nazi Germany were so great that she left to go and live in England. But Anne Frank, and you'll see, I don't think it's in the book, but it's in my suitcase. I've got my very own copy from when I was 12.
Sure.
And that book really alerted me to the danger of racial superiority, prejudice, and I identified really strongly with Anne Frank because when I read the book, I was 12, and that was the age in which she was sent off. And yesterday was the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, which is where Anne Frank died of typhus, which for me resonates that here we are today, one day later. 80 years ago, Bergen-Belsen was liberated. So I think the other thing that happened that was so profound, and my dad would tell the story over and over again, and we'd roll our eyes and say, oh, there's Dad's story again, is after the war, the only tennis club near where they lived, in an ex-serviceman's suburb in Joburg, the only tennis club was at a convent. So my dad would go up there to play tennis, and he arrived one Saturday, and there were two men in the rondavel waiting to go on and play, and there was a third man practicing against the practice wall. My dad waited for a while, and then he said to the two guys, why don't we make a double? Four of us, let's go and have a game of doubles. And the men in the rondavel said, no, we can't play with that guy. My dad said, but why not? And they said, well, because he's a bloody Jew. And my dad said, I'm very glad that my wife isn't here, because she wouldn't like what you've said. And the one oak says, and why not? And my dad said, well, she's married to a bloody Jew. And he walked off and never played tennis there again. Now, as a child hearing this, I'd look at my dad and say, but it's just like the other dads. You know, what's a bloody Jew? So, back to your question. The other thing is that everybody I mixed with in Sandringham were Jewish and communists. So my neighbor's aunt, I knew she was a commie. That was the word that was used. I remember looking at her and thinking, she's going to have horns, or she's going to be different. Anyway, about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when they were renovating Constitutional Hill, we went, and they were busy renovating the women's section. And there I looked, and I think I stopped dead in my tracks with Mike, and I said, look, there's Auntie Yetta, and her face was on the billboard. And I didn't realize as a child, I knew she was a commie, but I didn't realize she had been incarcerated in the prison.
Wow.
And the other thing is that, and I've never forgiven my mom for this, I was 10 and I was invited to a classmate's birthday party. My mom wouldn't let me go because her folks were commies. A week later, her desk was empty at school because they had gone into exile in England. So even though my mum was a founding member of Black Sash and was regarded as a white liberal, there were prejudices there as well. And one of the things that was quite nice about being the child of what was a mixed religious family was that I could date whoever I wanted.
Ooh.
You know, there were Jewish friends in my class who couldn't date the cool Christian guy. And there were Christian friends who wouldn't date a Jewish guy. I could have a free choice.
Yeah.
And I did. I did.
But obviously not a brown boy. You couldn't date that.
That's
time.
No, but I went back to my school.
Okay.
I went back to my school about, where am I now? It was on our 50th anniversary reunion. And I must take issue with Trevor Noah. Trevor, if you're looking at this, you call Northview a ghetto school in your book.
That was his school as well.
No, it was his friend's school.
Friend school, yes.
He went to Sandringham High, which was long after they took in their first intake of matrics when I'd left school. He went to Sandringham, but his mate who got arrested, and he didn't, went to Northview, and he refers to it as a ghetto school. Well, when I went there, they were writing trials, and I went into the hall, and all the names on the desks were Imsamang, Dlamini. It was a different place, but for me, still a center of learning. On the walls, unbelievably memorialized, were our pictures. Straight, undefaced. And I called the caretaker over, and there was a picture of me, which is in the book, in the tennis team. And I said to him, that's me. And the guy said, No, it's not. I didn't believe the old girl standing next to him was that young girl in the photograph.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so there weren't any brown
Yeah,
people there, but
Yeah.
the only diversity we had were Jewish, Christian, Portuguese.
Mm.
We sort of took it as normal.
Mm.
Cheers.
I find it I find it fascinating. This is coming as a brown boy here, but I find it fascinating that there was such a prejudice between Jewish people. The reason why I say that is because I mean, like with South Africa, you can see this person's black, this person's white, but how do you see that's a Jew, that isn't a Jew, and now why is there that animosity amongst each other? I mean, if we were all the same color but had different color eyes, I think we would still divide ourselves based
you
on
might
that.
be Manchester United or Liverpool.
You see,
I think so. I've got to correct that there was animosity. My mom married a Jewish guy. Her sister married a Jewish guy. My dad's sisters, only one married a Jewish guy. All the rest married Christian guys. So after the war, I think there was a great deal of, I mean, if you love someone, I mean, and certainly I think you'll see in the book that I found my dad was reading The Act of Immorality, which was the first book banned by the apartheid regime. And it was written about a young boy who was raised by the nanny, and he became obsessed with black women. And in those days, if you had an interracial relationship, you would be locked up. The police used to look through keyholes to try and find people having intimate relations, and you were breaking the law.
Yeah.
Trevor Noah will write and attest to that. It was not a good place. You know that in the book, I try, life's messy, so to write a memoir, I mean, I had a mess all over the floor, reports, stuff. So I used Shakespeare to help me order. So he wrote a soliloquy, The 7 Ages of Man. I have forgiven him for the gender bias. And in it he says, all the world's a stage, and men and women play a part. They have their exits and their entrances. Well, my stage was not a big stage. I was just conscious. Perhaps I had a walk-on part as a city councillor in Pietermaritzburg, and then as a children's rights and HIV/AIDS activist in my 40s and 50s. But I was no big deal. There are South Africans who certainly did not allow themselves to be divided by the apartheid regime, and were far braver than I am, and I don't want that to be misconstrued. I was an ordinary person.
but now, Yvonne, take us through your your 20s and your 30s. The reason why I ask is that's where we kind of are now, number one. So the landscape was definitely different then to what it is now. But I mean, honestly speaking, you're 20, you're 25, you're 26, or you're going into your 30s. Why? Life is good for you as a white person. So why would you get yourself involved in all of this? Like that is just as honest as I can ask it.
I knew what was going on. I read. I had friends. We talked. We also had a really good history teacher, and he would abandon the textbooks, and he would allow us to talk about what was going on. So I think I was a bit younger than 20, but there were things that happened. The station bomb, John Harris, he was part of something called the African Resistance Movement, ARM. And he says he phoned and warned that he would be detonating a bomb at the station. It is said that the police didn't react, so whether they were enabling it is still out there. But the young girl who was injured was my age. Her name was Glynis. My memory fails. So I thought about that. Then at the same time, and I think this is quite poetic, there was a girl of about my age growing up in Piet Retief, which is now called...
What's Piet Retief?
It's in here. Sorry.
Yo, I wouldn't know.
I've just gone blank. It happens when you're 74.
It's fine.
Does it happen to you guys?
It happens to us now.
Oh, yeah.
I can tell you.
Piet Retief, Gert.
No,
Gert,
not
maar dat is een school.
Gertsebandi. It's Gertsebandi
You think of the
district.
school.
I'm thinking of the school Gert, but it's right there by Piet. It used to be there.
Talk about something else and I'll find it.
Okay.
So this young woman, a girl, she was born to so-called white parents, but she was classified as coloured, and they kicked her out of school.
No.
And her name was Sandra Lang.
It's called Mkondo.
Mkondo,
Mkondo.
thank you.
Yes.
Thanks. It's in the book. So Sandra Lang had her life turned upside down, and she was like my age because she was the wrong colour. I mean, how do you pretend you can't see this stuff? And the Rand Daily Mail, there would be censorship, blackouts, blanks.
Propaganda.
And my Jewish friends, you know, they identified strongly with the Holocaust and what had happened in Nazi Germany, and many of them were founding members of what was known as the Progressive Party. Many of them, as I've said previously, were communist. I mean, I was aware. And then at Rhodes, I went to Rhodes. I did a 2-year course. And it's in the book. I think that was at Rhodes, something happened that changed the way I conducted myself from the time I was 20. I was asked to be a guinea pig in a 3rd-year psych student's experiment. She was on Housecom. She was a 3rd year. And she said, would you be part of this experiment for my final prac? And I said, yes. She said, well, come to the room at a certain time. I walked into the room. I was the only first year. I didn't realize, I mean, I knew I was the only first year. Everybody in the room was a 3rd year, and they were members of Housecom. Whoa. So the experiment she put up on an overhead was, here are various strips of paper, strips in different color. You must tell, I'm going to ask you one at a time, which is the longest color on the strip? Green, long, red, short, and then I'll mess them around. You've just got to tell me which is the longest. I thought, hell, this is so childlike for a 3rd-year psych prac, ridiculously easy. So she'd put it up on, it was a bar graph, and she'd put the first one on, and she'd ask, what's the longest one? Red. What's the longest one? And everybody said red, because obviously it was red. It went on a few times. And then the overhead she put on, suddenly green was the longest, obviously, so long. And you said black. And you said black. And you said black. And when she came to Yvonne, what did I say? I said black. I didn't ask, but it's not black, it's green. Why are you all saying black? It's green. And it happened again. What's the longest color? The longest color was purple. But everybody said green, which was the shortest color. Green, green, green. And when she came to me, what did I say?
You had to say green.
I did.
That's the experiment.
I perjured myself. I crawled into bed that night. I couldn't believe that I had lost my agency. I bumped into her a couple of days afterwards, and she said, we had all been briefed, except you. We wanted to see if you would follow the herd or whether you would stand up. And I would never, after that, keep quiet again. So I'm always the idiot putting up her hand and asking a question. And I guess I took that with me when I met Mr. Mandela in 1990, just as he had been released.
Yeah.
Came to Pietermaritzburg. I was an independent city councillor at the time. And I was invited to meet him. There was maybe 10, 20 people in the room. And when he and they'd put a dais, a platform up. And Mr. Mandela, he wasn't President Mandela then, was sitting there with his entourage. And we were sitting literally like as close as you guys are to me. And he talked about being liberated, the prison. He talked about his dreams. And then there was question time. And it was just after the 16th of June. And so the ANC made a big show of the Youth Day platforms. And at that point, I was an HIV/AIDS activist, really passionate about the fact that children were being orphaned because their caregivers were dying. And there was no movement and no acknowledgement. There was no talk about choices and protection. And from the Youth Day stage, I asked Mr. Mandela why none of his members had used that platform to talk about HIV and AIDS, because I thought it was a lost opportunity to conscientize people and save lives. And Mr. Mandela said it was not in their culture to talk about sexuality. I saw him again 6 years later at the Durban AIDS conference, and he was a committed activist. His own son, Makato, had died of AIDS. And he himself was providing ARVs against the government stance of Thabo Mbeki to the young people who received his bursaries who had tested positive. And I also took on Thabo Mbeki, and I think that sort of courage came from that Rhodes experiment, that I would never be quiet in the face of authority again. But that was when President Mbeki denied that HIV/AIDS, he thought it was a disease of poverty. And with Zaki Ahmed at the lead, TAC, other NGOs, we were trying to get nevirapine and ARVs provided by the state. And it was not being provided. But we had an outbreak of foot and mouth disease in Pietermaritzburg, and President Mbeki came to the city hall, and I was on a mission. I wanted to challenge him. I was very angry. So I got myself right in the front row, and I had my program. And at question time, I think I was the first one. I waved my program, and I got the mic. And I said to him, Mr. President, why are you rushing in the army to provide vaccines for cattle, and you will not provide nevirapine for pregnant women in our country. He was furious. He was furious.
What did he say?
Well, he assumed I was a member of the DA, I think in those days they were. And I don't know what he said. I mean, I was quite nervous, but he was very cross with me. Maybe Rob Haswell remembers what he said, but I'm afraid I don't. But he was very, very cross.
Sure. Just quickly on Nelson Mandela. Some people say he actually didn't go to prison. What are your thoughts on that? Because I mean, there's always
That
the rumors and
yeah,
the conspiracies about
it wasn't
that's
him.
not the Nelson Mandela that went into
No.
prison.
No, I've heard that conspiracy, and people must fact check, man. Let me tell you, people went to visit him in Robben Island. No, I find that, like, that's absurd. And what happened at that time when he came to City Hall, and it was before the election, the mayor at the time was a very fulsome woman. And I wasn't there, but Rob Haswell, who was one of the first people to become a member of the ANC government, non-government, he was in Parliament. And when Mr. Mandela was released, he and 4 other MPs from what was then, I think, the DP, Democratic Party, asked Mr. Mandela if they could be the ANC reps in the South African Parliament before the election, and Mr. Mandela concurred. So Rob Haswell became a member of the ANC, representing the ANC, and it caused a huge furore in Pietermaritzburg, death threats, and it wasn't crossing the floor, but it was like crossing the floor. And I've since asked Haswell, why on earth did you not just resign? And he said, well, because had I resigned and there'd been a by-election, only white people could have voted, so what was the point when we were heading towards a multi-party democracy?
How was the feel like during that period of transition for you? Could you feel the tension in Pietermaritzburg specifically, but South Africa as a whole? Because there was a lot of fear. A lot of people were leaving the country and that sort of stuff. How was it for you? What did you experience at that time?
It's what I'd waited for. The fear, I think, was more in the black community. I mean, we had the 7-day war here. Do you know what happened? You know that I was very close to the family of my domestic worker. You know, a lot of people say, oh, she was like family. We were like family. We raised each other's children. We shared children. She died about 15 months ago. And I was asked to speak at her funeral, which was in the far reaches of the Edendale Valley. And what used to happen during the 7-day war and during the ANC-IFP tension in this transition period was that there would be bus boycotts and people couldn't get to work. And I was working for an anti-apartheid organization called PAXA, Pietermaritzburg Agency for Christian Social Awareness. Peter Kirchhoff Street is named after the man I worked for. And if my helper couldn't get into work, I would take my daughter Jo, who was 6 months old, into work. And I'd try and work while she was sitting on. And my helper would actually come in somehow, pick up my baby and then walk her home, because we lived quite close to the center of town. And I mentioned this when I was giving my tribute to my helper 15 months ago. And I mentioned the 7-day war. During the 7-day war, she used to walk to fetch my baby, then walk home. The young woman who was translating for me said, in front of hundreds of mourners, what was the 7-day war? I turned to the men, the priests, the religious leaders leading the service. They were all men. And I turned to them and I said, did you hear that question? This young woman doesn't know what happened in Edendale and the 7-Day War.
I don't even know.
20,000 people were displaced. 80 people were killed. It was a war zone. I would go and visit friends in Hilton and look across to Sweetwaters and to Ashdown, and there'd be fire. It was murder.
What? Why? Okay.
When my daughter was really small, like, how old would she have been? A couple of months old. We were manning a 24-hour phone line.
Yes.
It was printed by Prof. John Aitchison from UKZN and Harley, called No Blood on Our Hands, that chronicles the 7-Day War. It was an internecine conflict between the ANC and the IFP, fueled. I mean, we shouldn't forget it. History is important, and we're not teaching it in our schools.
We are
And
for sure
So
not.
the Edendale area, my grandparents were from there. It was called Presseslau.
Places
Yes.
Places like, yeah.
Still
So
there.
before the Group Areas Act, where the Indians were placed in Edendale amongst the black people as well. Indians and blacks stayed together before, and then the Group Areas Act moved the Indians out because they had built sort of a stronghold, the Indian and the black community. And was that before the war or?
Long before. I mean, the Group
Long.
Areas Act came in 48.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you asked me in my preparation about the Land Act and land expropriation.
Yes.
So just to go back, I had the privilege of, is it still being filmed?
Sorry, I'm stuck in here. Yeah, sorry. Are we good? Yeah. All right. Sorry. Carry on.
So you asked me about my 20s, and there's one thing I want to talk about my 20s. So I went traveling. I hitched around Europe. One of the things that happened is in a Portuguese village, my good friend and I were picked up by a really rather dishy young Portuguese guy who decided he was going to be our guide. And I was dark, my friend was dark, we could have been Portuguese, but he checked out our shoes. And because our shoes were so crummy, he knew we weren't Portuguese, because Portuguese shoes are beautiful. But we were wearing sort of felskins and things. And he stayed around us for about 3 or 4 days, showed us the localities, took us on the buses. He was really a nice guy. But he'd fought in Angola. He'd been called up by the Portuguese government and fought in Angola. And on our last day, brought out a photograph of himself, battle fatigues, in the middle of the African bush. And we looked at the photograph. And from his hands was hanging a rope with things on it, like kebab of fruit. We looked at this, and then suddenly we knew what we were looking at.
Skulls.
They were the ears of the people that he had killed during the Angola War.
Whoa.
His trophies. What else happened?
So what did you guys do? Were you like,
You're
hey,
not like, well, I'm the murderer.
Yeah, no. We were saying goodbye to him. We talk about it.
Must have been
What could we do?
perplexed.
I mean, so I went to Namibia about 4 years ago. I went to see the museum built by the North Koreans. So my family called it my misery tours. I want to know the real history of my life. So I've been to some places. I'm segueing
That's
right
okay.
all over the place. So I've been to Steve Biko's grave. I've been to the South African War, the Boer War Museum. I've been to the Boer War battlefields. I've been to the Craddock Fall graves in Queenstown. I've been to Kliptown, where the Freedom Charter was signed. I've been to Vilakazi Street. I've been to Paul Kruger's house. My dad took me there. My dad used to do business with the South African Defence Force. During the April holidays, when he went to see them in Pretoria from Joburg, we would go. One day, we're driving home past Central Prison. It's still there, brooding building. And the Vierkleur, the flag, was flying at half-mast out there. My dad said, "Do you know why the flag is at half-mast?" Now, I'm like 10. I said, "No." He said, "Because they're hanging people." That was at Easter holidays. They were also hanging Christ and celebrating Christ's crucifixion. And as a child, this whole thing, the crucifixion, the gallows, was there for the rest of my life. And I think as a 10-year-old, I became an anti-death penalty person.
Straight away.
You've struck a light bulb in my head because you said you've gone to the grave of Steve Biko. Why did you visit Steve Biko's grave?
Out of respect. I've been to Auschwitz. There was a liberation human rights lawyer in Namibia called Anton Lebowski. He was murdered shortly before the end of the war by the CCB, the Civil Cooperation Bureau of South Africa. He was shot outside his house. When I went to the museum built by the North Koreans, they showed really heartrending depictions of Cuito Carnavale, which was a huge battle South Africa waged in Angola against the Cubans who were fighting with the Angolans. We saw the genocide of the Ovambo and the Herero people. But there's one little picture I could find of Anton Lebowski. So I dragged my friends and Mike, and we went to where he had been assassinated. Because history matters. I went to Auschwitz. I went in a train.
Yeah, talk us through that, because that's not the place that everybody's been to, and there's a lot of stories about the place and the feel you get when you walk into it. Give us a bit of a guide as to what that day was about.
So Anne Frank is a pivotal influence in my life. I mean, there are a few others, the books. So I had been to her home where she hid twice in my life. Yeah. Then my misery tours, the first one out of South Africa was the Normandy landing beaches, the thousands of graveyards. And as a Maritzburg College old boy, the only way that I could make sense of the numbers of graves that I saw was to imagine a hall full of Maritzburg College boys. So that would be like 1,000, okay? So here we have 200,000 young men killed in Flanders or the Somme. How do you picture that? Okay. let's try and imagine halls full of Maritzburg boys. I also visited German graves when I went into Flanders. I laid a wreath at the Menin Gate as a South African on the tour. I was the only South African. So they play the last post, and they've been doing this at, I think it's 8:00 at night in June. Every night they've got a piper playing the last post, and and under an arch with all the names of the people they've found, and they're still finding people in the fields of Flanders. Mm-hmm. And then what I would do is I'd go and work as a waiter in a restaurant and as a cleaner of holiday homes on the Isles of Scilly, which is off the Cornwall coast of England. So I would go for a couple of months and wait tables, and I'd say, "Hello, my name is Yvonne. I'm your waiter today." And they'd say, "Oh, what part of South Africa do you come from?" Anyway, so Berlin became a place I wanted to go to. It started with Cabaret, the movie with Liza Minnelli, Kennedy saying, "Ich bin ein Berliner," when he went to Berlin. Who said, "Tear down this wall." Help me. One of the presidents said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Anyway.
Before our time.
Yeah, it is, and I've gone blank. So I wanted to go to Berlin. And I walked through Nazi Berlin. I went to the Holocaust Memorial. I went to the what they call the Sinter Memorial, the Romany Memorial. The Gypsies were also persecuted. And I went to the Gay Memorial. Gay memorials. The Nazis persecuted gay men and women.
Homosexuals, gypsies, Jews, black people,
communists.
It was a whole
And
lot of people.
The Germans
it's
just
in the
wanted
book.
to be.
They wanted an Aryan race.
Yeah, they just wanted to be
it was
the
the
only
master
people.
race.
Yeah.
Purity.
Blonde hair, blue eyes.
Yes.
That was
yes.
the belief.
Yes.
If you were not that, you were not of Aryan descent.
Absolute madness.
But the concentration camps itself.
So I've never had panic attacks. I'm cool, I think. But I walked through a place called the Bendler Block, which is the only Nazi war building that remained intact. And I walked under the archway, and in fact, that's where they conspired to try and blow Hitler up.
The failed bombing.
And the cobble streets in this archway, as I walked through it, I realized that Hitler had walked through there, and it was terrifying. And when I signed the visitor's book, the entry above mine was written by a Canadian girl whose great uncle had been one of the conspirators. It was deep. So from Berlin, I caught a train to Warsaw. Now, that train had plush seats, Wi-Fi, waiters serving drinks. I could have been on a tourist train, but I was going on the tracks in the same direction as people had gone in cattle trucks to their death. And I had to say to myself, put away your phone and look out the window. Warsaw was also terrifying because I went to the ghetto, what remains of the ghetto. I went to the museum where there was this most incredible reconstruction of Warsaw as it was before the war, and then the Nazis bombed Warsaw to the ground after the Warsaw Uprising, and then there was the ghetto uprising before that. and you just saw the distraction. And then again, I caught another train to Krakow, which is the springboard for Auschwitz. And I was on my own, and a bus picked me up. The scale of it is more that you read about it. The scale of what you see is just too much. And the ovens and the iconic Arbeit macht frei, that tower, it's hard to talk about. On the way back on the bus, we went down an underpass, and on the walls of the underpass, the concrete walls, was graffiti that said, it had a swastika in Krakow, and it said Juden Gang, which is Jews out. I thought, I don't believe that I'm actually seeing this. So I went to the bus driver and I said, or there was a conductor sort of fellow, what is that? He said, no, it's not anti-Semitism. It's football violence. I said, what? Anyway, I got to my hotel room and I Googled, and football violence and racism is rife in Poland. And you Google it and you'll see, and it's against black players,
yes.
blacks, Jews.
It's the most hostile place to play a football game. Players are escorted in and out, and the tunnels go underground to escape. It's absolutely insane.
It's anarchy. Anyway, a friend of mine who was the director of the Cradle of Humankind had also made a trip to Auschwitz about 2 or 3 months before me. That night at about 8 o'clock, he phoned me because he knew how one needs to debrief. And that was the kindest thing that he could ever have done, is to phone me from South Africa to say, how are you? So, Auschwitz is beyond. And Primo Levi, who I quote in the book, and I say, can I find it and read it? Because you've asked me. At the same time that I was getting ready to go to Auschwitz, there was that right-wing riot in Charlottesville in America, where the anti-rioters were mowed down by the right rioters. And instead of condemning that action out of hand, Donald Trump in his first term said there were some decent people on both sides in Charlottesville. Now, those people who were the right-wing rioters in Charlottesville were shouting, blood and soil, blood and soil. Now, I'd never heard blood and soil, but I actually found it on an information poster at one of the synagogues in Berlin that had been destroyed on Kristallnacht. And it's part of what you read in Mein Kampf. Blood and soil, people's community, and living space. I say the echoes of this reverberate all over the world in today's conflicts. And I believe that the horrors I saw during my war tours are not over yet. And then I quote Primo Levi, and I see it in the context of what's happening in Palestine and Israel. Many people, he wrote, Primo Levi, many nations can find themselves holding, more or less wittingly, that every stranger is an enemy. The story of the death camps should be understood by everyone as a sinister alarm signal.
Sure.
So it's heavy stuff. And the world at the moment is a heavy place.
I want to ask
Yes.
something. We've touched on Adolf Hitler a little bit. I've always been fascinated with the whole Nazi movement and what Hitler had done at the time and riled the masses, the propaganda. During his death, I would call it, do you think Hitler died or do you think he escaped?
Oh no, I went to the bunker,
Yeah.
and amazingly, it's a parking lot. There's no memorial there. They didn't want it to become a place of martyrdom. So off I went, and there was this parking lot. It was quite banal and actually okay. No,
Because there's conspiracy theorists that talk about Adolf Hitler escaping to Argentina, where they had set up a whole
yes,
Nazi
yeah,
sort of regime.
yeah.
And there's constant stories about it coming out and saying that Hitler actually died there. I'm sure you've heard about it as well. What is your say on that sort of a take? Do you think it's a possibility?
No, I don't
or
think it's a
you write
possibility.
it off completely?
I think if you do your research, you'll see that Russia has kept his skeleton, and they've done DNA, and it's now confirmed that was Hitler.
Wow.
And at the time of his death, he was addicted to painkillers, drugs.
Yes.
I mean, do you know how drugs were used by the Nazi troops?
Yeah.
The Blitzkrieg. They took uppers, methamphetamines to keep awake and keep killing. So they, no, don't believe that.
Yeah. I didn't know about the Russian skeleton of Hitler being found.
Yeah, no,
Fascinating.
no, I have.
Have they got it in a museum or is it in a lab? Or?
No, I think it's in a lab, and if you can check it out on the web.
Fascinating.
Let's come back to South Africa quickly.
Yeah.
The black sash. This is something I didn't know existed until I read your memoir. What is it, and why did you join it?
It's a human rights organization started in 1955 by middle-class white women. If you look at the photographs, and my mother was one of them, hats, white gloves, frocks, and a black sash. I remember my mum's black sash, and I remember the badge. The black sash is symbolic of the death of the Constitution, because at that time the Nats removed the colored people from the voters' roll, and were also making black women carry passes. And the black sash members, I think about 20,000, marched, maybe that's too many, but they marched to Pretoria to deliver a petition a year before the ANC's Women March. And it was a protest organization, and I joined it because at the time, it was about 86. I knew what was going on, and I knew that I needed to protest. But I was no big struggle hero. I didn't want to get locked up. I joined the Black Sash, and we protested the laws of apartheid. We set up an advice office where a lot of people who were illiterate were not getting their pensions. So it was an advice office where we would intervene on behalf of powerless people. We often were interlocutors for employers against their for employees against their employers. We had an advice office, and we would protest with placards against detention without trial, all the apartheid laws. And we once did get charged. There was something called the Riotous Assemblies Act, which prohibited protests. And if you wanted to protest, you'd have to write and ask permission. And you'd be given permission from this time to that time, only half an hour. And on the one occasion, we were protesting detention without trial, I think. And we stood in the Tatham Art Gallery Gardens, and the Mail and Guardian photographer was there. And at 5-1, he said, "Can I take your photograph?" So we all stood with our placards and our black sash. I was pregnant at the time. And he took a photograph of us at 5-1. And as we walked to take our stand outside the City Hall, the Special Branch were taking off photographs. And a couple of days later, we all got told that we were being charged under the Writers' Assemblies Act because we'd stood from 5-1, not 1 o'clock.
My ignorance.
So wait,
Sorry.
it's a very funny story in the end. So eventually we now have to go to court, to the magistrate's court. And we asked the lecturer at UKZN if he would please defend us. And he said yes, he would. And we had a meeting, and there were, about 19 of us. And he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call you up to the stand one by one. And I'm going to ask you a few questions. Your name, how long you've been a member of Black Sash, and what it is you do for Black Sash. So alphabetically, and he comes to the one woman who looked so elegant. She's a very tall, lovely woman, used to wear coloured scarves, and she's now on the stand. It's a hot day. The smell from the cells below is wafting up. Yeah. Even the security branch guys who had arrested or charged us and taken our photographs sitting there were sweating. It was, and been through about 6 or 7 women. They've all said, well, how old, how member of Black Sash. This beautiful woman stands up and she gives her name. And our lawyer says, how long have you been a member of Black Sash? And she said, 5 years. And he said, and what do you do for Black Sash? And she said, I make jam.
I make jam for Black Sash.
And the magistrate just said, case dismissed.
Get out.
So, yeah, the Black Sash still exists today, but it is a research and advocacy. It has one office in Cape Town. But what also happened about Black Sash is just before my election, the phone rings. And it's this very well-spoken woman on the phone. She says, are you running for council? I said, yes. She said, do you tell the truth? I said, yes. She said, are you a member of Black Sash? I said, yes. And she put the phone down. I thought, what's this? 5 minutes later, the witness phone. We've had a tip-off that you're a member of Black Sash, and we have to tell the story. So I said, yeah, I'm a member of Black Sash. I work in the advice office. I help people get their outstanding payments, and all we have a Black Sash, and we want human rights. So a few days before the election, I thought it might cost me the election. They ran the story that Yvonne Spain is a member of Black Sash. I mean, we were really a group of concerned, middle-class white women who made a stand. And if my daughter ever asked me, what did you do during apartheid? I could say I was a member of Black Sash.
So, my ignorance in South African history, I have never heard of any organization that belonged to white people that actually fought against apartheid.
Sure, there were so many.
Yeah, like I don't even, it doesn't even occur to me that something like that exists, that there were white people in numbers protesting against what was happening. Which then brings me to South Africa today. There's still divide, and we are 30 years on. Do you think we've had enough time?
No, not enough time. We're a work in progress. And really, I celebrate the courtesy and respect that I receive from Black South Africans. I don't think we acknowledge enough that we have this ugly past that has been forgiven. I think the riots of 1921, where are we, 2021? They were contained. Most South Africans said, not in our name. When Chris Hani was assassinated, we were contained. When the ANC lost its majority last year, it accepted its loss.
What kind of a South Africa do you think we would have, just in your opinion, if Steve Biko and Chris Hani were still alive? Well, in the 90s.
Were you supporters of the Chris Hani ideology?
I was never frightened of the ANC. I was glad that the ANC was unbanned. I was glad that Nelson Mandela was our president. I was glad that we had that glue in our country. I'm sad beyond words it's been squandered, the trust. I wish there were more younger people who were informed and who stood up to become public servants. I don't know what we would look like. I think politics can attract the wrong people who are in there for power. I think Chris Hani and Steve Biko, like Mandela, were formed in a different world where their struggle was just. I hardly see that in any politician in the world at the moment. My challenge is to young people. The future isn't mine, it's yours. You've got to stand up. All my Jewish friends are out the country. All their children and grandchildren, the contributions they're making in Canada, Australia, we've lost that. Let's not lose any more people.
Well, the Afrikaans, I don't know how big it is, that community that is talking about becoming refugees for America.
They're welcome. Go to America.
What do you think of that?
I think they've been given too much airspace. I don't think solidarity and solidariteit and I can't remember the other one. I think they are a fringe group. I prefer to listen to a woman called Louise van Rijn. There's somebody you should be interviewing.
Tell us about her.
She wrote an extremely well thought out article in the Sunday Times talking about a new Afrikanerdom. She's a lecturer at Stellenbosch, and I can put you in touch with her. So, and also I mentioned to you Ilihle Machikicha from Section 27, who talks about the objections to the Bella Act, and I think we should also think about Ngoyi Gatoibi on the Land Act, because they've all passed constitutional muster, and South Africa needs redress. You know, the Bella Act, from what I understand, the furore is around the SGBs and their autonomy. Well, if it goes to the Constitutional Court, which I think it's in the process of doing, let it be heard. But SGBs cannot overreach themselves and exclude people on the basis of language or race. And I think that's what the Bella Act is trying to do, is to make sure that there's equality. And from what Emihle said in that interview that she made for Carte Blanche, it's reasoned, and I think maybe Solidarity should be listening to that.
If you were 20 years old today in this South Africa, what would be the one thing you'd be fighting for?
Safeguarding of women and children.
It's a big issue at the moment, actually.
I'd be concerned of gambling. I'd be concerned of drivers with no sense of responsibility.
Fine.
It's very interesting.
I would want all caregivers to talk to their children about their sexuality and their choices. And it must start when the children are 10, 11, 12.
Well, can you expand on that? What do you mean by that?
Identify as that stuff.
The
LGBT.
sexual identity, I understand.
Yeah.
Being aware that we are sexual beings. And if you don't manage your sexuality, there are consequences for you for the rest of your life. My mother had that talk with me. And it was about, we're human, we're sexual. But manage your sexuality. There's reputational damage. There's unwanted pregnancies. There's sexually transmitted diseases. If you have this knowledge, protect yourself, make wise decisions. And I think we need to engage men far more. You need to engage your sons. And I'd be terrified of social media. You've seen Adolescence, the movie from...
Yes,
I've just
Netflix.
I mean,
watched it.
how do you manage your children's online fanaticism? We're going to grow humps because we do this. I do it. I play Scrabble and word games on my phone. But if you have access to violence and porn and gambling, how do you... I look to you guys. How do we manage this? How does the faith community manage this?
I think the faith community has been so marginalized as a whole from the schooling system. I don't know if when you were in school, every morning before they would open like in prayer or have a Bible just as a religious form. I think that's completely out of the schooling system, is it not? No, I might be mistaken. I stand to be corrected. But I feel like religion has been pushed aside significantly in society now, which has changed a lot. I feel like when we were brought up and when we were at school, there was a lot more rules and regulations. You were taught faith and you were taught this. And now the world's at a point where you can't do that sort of stuff. You can't gender dictate almost. You're a boy or you're a girl. That sort of stuff is gone, you know? And I feel like that's caused a lot of disorder.
Do you think in South Africa it's like that, though?
Massive, bro.
You think so?
It's just in Maritzburg where it's starting to take off. But in places like Cape Town and Joburg, there's been stories of people teaching kids about you don't have to be a boy, you don't have to be a girl. That sort of stuff is starting to spread. And as a kid, I think when you're that young, 10 and 11, those sort of conversations are not ones that you can have yet, I think.
No, I tend to disagree that in all things balance, that make room for people who are different.
Mm-hmm.
If you're feeling different, be free to express it. I think South Africa can claim to be diverse on paper. Our constitution accommodates people of all different faiths. So unless you choose to go to a religious school, I would favor a moment of quiet meditation, each to their own.
But when you were at school, was there no prayer, morning prayer?
Well, yes, there was.
Yeah, and that was Christianity, wasn't it?
It was because it was so Jewish. Everything was
Torah.
God.
Okay.
But
okay.
now, is God a man or a woman?
A man. According to pretexts and sightings. Is your opinion different? I would welcome it.
No, I think whatever goodness we need to find in ourselves, not in texts, not in religions that are very old and that divide people. That kindness should be the religion, and if you formalize it, make sure that what is being formalized is kind and inclusive.
Kind and inclusive, full stop. I like that. I've got two important questions, and then we've been chatting for some time. Is there a freedom fighter / activist that the history books don't really speak about that you think we should be aware of or look to do some research on? Because we have the same names, but is there a person who you think might have played a pivotal role that is underrated / isn't spoken about much? Because there were a lot of people doing the work.
Look, I worked with two stalwarts recognized by Mandela, Peter Kirchhoff and Peter Brown.
Peter Brown Drive.
Yeah, Peter Brown would be very unhappy that so many people are having accidents
on his road.
Yeah. So Peter Brown was in the room when Mandela had that meeting. And I watched Madiba from the stage. He's looking at everyone, saw me, walked on. I was sitting next to Peter. He came back. And the next minute, Madiba's off the stage and walking to Peter with his arms out and a smile as big as his arms. Peter stands up and they embrace. And I'm sitting there like Forrest Gump. And I hear Madiba say, "Oh, Peter, I was looking for a much older man." Peter was like 73, my age now.
Oh, jeez.
And Madiba was that much older. So Peter Brown was banned. Did you know what banning was?
Mm-mm.
So if you were anti-apartheid and you were a threat to the government, you had to be at home only with your family and stay within a particular geographic location. And you had to report to the police every month, every week.
Parole.
Yeah. Peter was banned for 10 years.
Wow.
If he went to watch his son play rugby, he had to stand in the corner and watch. Peter used to go and visit Winnie Mandela in Brandfort. And Winnie Mandela wrote to Peter.
I had no idea who Peter Brown was.
I just thought it was a bad highway.
And we've been driving in Peter Brown.
Hey, where's
Yeah.
Peter Brown here?
And Peter
Kirchhoff.
Kirchhoff.
He started Paxa. I worked for him when my daughter was 6 months old.
Yes.
They, like Peter Brown, stood against forced removals, supported detainees. Peter was locked up in 1986, I think it was, in solitary for about 50 days
Was this because of his
because he was
politically
left.
active?
Yeah.
And when we're done with this, will you come back to his relationship with Winnie as well? Because that's fascinating that somebody from here had a relationship with one of the biggest
Yeah, where is
political activists in our democracy.
it? Well, yeah, so the other thing I want to tell you, I also went to Brandfort because I wanted to get the right view, the correct view of history. What I saw at Brandfort, whether you like Winnie Mandela, Madikizela Mandela or not, was a desecration of the house that she was banished to. There was condoms, feces, litter, destruction, and a big sign that said Winnie Madikizela Museum. And we were told that about 3 to 4 million rand had been squandered and nothing had been done. I wrote to the Minister of Tourism then, Derek Hanekom. I never got a message, a reply. I wrote to Carte Blanche. I wrote to the Sunday Times.
That's what we should be fighting for. Corruption. Because everything else is there. Like you guys have done the hard part in getting us all united. But now I think if we had to be activists, we should be activists against corruption, because that's just where the real mess really is, I think. The way you're saying it. Because if I look at, I always see on Facebook, they people post how Durban used to look, how Pietermaritzburg used to look. And yes, it looked amazing. Why can't we do that now?
Well, I think it only looked like that because there were white areas only that are being documented. The masses weren't allowed in those spaces.
Yes, but let's look at the same places that they have there.
Yeah.
So, City Hall, Durban Beach, why can't we keep the same beauty?
Well, think about it. Back then, only a certain segment of the population were allowed to utilize those spaces, right?
Yes. So,
But post-apartheid, those spaces are now open to everyone. So controlling it was easier back then than it is now.
I disagree. I think you can still control it. You can still keep it clean. Look at Cape Town.
Yeah, yeah.
You can still keep it
Have
clean.
you been to Crossroads?
Where's
Have
that?
you been to Khayelitsha? Cape Town.
Well, yes. So again, I'm talking about just those nice, distinct features of the city. All right. For example, Pietermaritzburg has City Hall and everything around it, where the Mahatma Gandhi statue is. Service delivery is poor. It's poor there.
It is poor.
And-
And you, as young people, should be in there holding people to account,
That's what I'm saying.
asking who's getting the jobs.
That's what I'm saying.
Do we have diligence tests for the people who apply for the jobs? There's a whole thing going on right now that the investigation into the appointment of one of the staff members at City Hall has been put on hold because they cannot find the documentation. There should be consequence management.
We also don't want to die though, so it gets they
Okay,
can
so
get like that.
I mean, this is a very serious thing, and I don't know how we should have maybe a whistleblowing department.
The whistleblowers are falling as well. I don't know if you saw in some of the news.
No.
So that's where it's tricky now, because your life is at stake. You're gonna get there, and you're gonna want to make some changes, and they're gonna say, "Baba, relax, relax," and they'll be like, "We know where you live. We know where everybody lives."
Violence is pervasive, and I have no answer. But I would go back and say that the faith communities led from the front during apartheid and they should be leading from the front now and holding their own congregants to account. And it's not about being well-founded and rich yourself. It's about doing the right thing and helping the communities that don't have what you have and calling out the baddies. Here it is. I found what. This is what Winnie Mandela wrote.
Real baddies. Not those baddies.
To Peter, you will probably never guess just how much your visits meant to me. I was able to face each lonely day ahead courageously.
Wow.
Winnie Mandela.
Powerful.
Winnie Mandela.
So powerful.
Yvonne, it's you have a favorite color. It's very clear to us. Can you tell us about
It's black.
the
Color's black. Like the bar graph.
No,
It's black.
we're not going to agree. Can you tell us about the significance of purple? Purple hair, purple book, purple glasses, purple flower that you brought
Frustration.
us, purple veldskoen. Tell us about the significance of the color purple for you.
Okay, so usually our answer it's better than 50 Shades of Grey.
Is it though,
I'm
Uncle Mike?
I'm just looking at you, Uncle
Is
Mike.
it better than 50 Shades of Grey?
So I was walking through the Cape Town airport and there was this little girl and she was following me. And her mum was saying, come, hurry up. She's following me and I had purple in my hair. I was probably wearing purple. And as her mum dragged her away, she said to me, you're beautiful. I mean, nobody calls a 70-year-old woman beautiful. Nobody sees a 70-year-old woman. But the children think, pardon? No, it wasn't.
In a prime.
No, it was at Michael's wedding. It was 10 years ago. So I was 64.
There we go.
So I looked it up.
Sorry, for those who are watching, Uncle Mike
Mike
is
is
here.
right,
so that's
and he's not my uncle.
yeah, well,
No, he's
yes, of
our
course.
uncle.
No,
He's our
no. But yes.
So there's a word for it. It's called porphyry. Porphyry.
I thought that was a type of like pornography or something. I was trying to read it on the transcript. I didn't know what it was.
Porphyry. So in culture, purple is huge. Think about the color purple. That was the first movie of Oprah Winfrey and
Was it
Whoopi
Whoopi?
Goldberg. Purple Rain, Prince.
Purple Rain.
Yeah. The vestments that the priests wear at Easter and Lent is purple. During the late 80s and the protests in Cape Town, the police used water cannons and they dyed the water purple so that they could find the people who'd been protesting. And they said in Cape Town, the purple shall govern.
Why didn't they do that in the unrest?
The July unrest, bro.
In the July unrest, or maybe change it a different color. But yes, I remember that the purple shall govern.
Yeah.
Sure. Purple dye.
Purple's a rich color, and the dye itself in the medieval art world was very difficult to come by. Rhodes, where I went, Rhodes University's livery colour is purple. So is the House of Windsor. But not Windsor, one of the royal houses. We won't talk about colonialism.
Why does Nelson Mandela say he went to UCT but wishes he could have gone to Wits, but at least he didn't go to Rhodes? Why does he say it? Why did he say that?
Did he say that?
I think that was one of his lines.
No. He went to Wits.
Oh yeah, Wits, and he went to UCT. I'm only saying it because I saw
Probably a meme.
It was Ike's, the
yeah.
UCT versus Marty's in the finals of the Varsity Cup, where somebody had that quote. I don't know. We'll have to
Really?
fact check it. And it said, I went to Wits, but I wish I'd gone to UCT, but at least I didn't go to Rhodes. And then it says Nelson Mandela.
Oh, it's just a fake quote.
You think it was a fake quote?
Yeah. Like there's the other one. I love the baddies, Gandhi.
Oh,
You know what I mean?
okay,
Like one of
okay.
those,
So it's a
you know,
fake quote. Sorry,
those fake
sorry,
ones.
sorry. Fake quote. Fake
So
quote.
we went to where Gandhi was assassinated, went to India, saw the site. So I drag my family to all these
Sure.
places just
Yeah.
to get a sense of where we came from and where we could be going if we don't watch out.
Sure.
I think it's fascinating. I mean, from having a look at your memoir, especially with the current friction that's happening in South Africa, Trump tariffs, people divisive, and all of that, just to understand what it was like for you during your time in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s versus what it is now. Because I always think to myself, is it as bad as it was then? But I've never lived then, but you did. So I think we need to have more conversations like this with people like you so that we actually have a clearer picture of the past and we're informed and we understand that what our duty is as South Africans today in order to make it a better place for our children. So that said, is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you think is important?
Oh, guys, I don't know. Thank you for having me. Not often when you're 74, you do something completely new. A podcast. Other people jump out of aeroplanes. No, thank you. And keep challenging people. And it was good to be with some young South Africans with their eye on the future.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne.
That was
So much
fascinating.
knowledge, so much
Fascinating.
power. We appreciate your contribution.